There was a moment when one woman had to choose between staying silent and possibly living safe, or speaking up and possibly dying. She chose to speak, and because she did, an entire nation survived. This is not a movie. This really happened. And what she did before she made that choice is something almost nobody talks about. Her name was Esther. And if you've ever felt too small, too scared, or too unqualified to do something big that God is calling you to do, you need to hear her story today. Because what she teaches us about courage and about prayer could change the way you face your next hard decision. So here's the situation Esther found herself in. She was a young Jewish woman living in Persia, a foreign land, during a time when her people were far from home. She didn't grow up with parents. Her mom and dad had passed away, and she was raised by her cousin, a man named Mordecai, who treated her like his own daughter. Life wasn't easy for her from the start. She already knew what it felt like to lose something important. She already knew what it felt like to depend on someone else to survive. Then something happened that changed everything. The king of Persia was looking for a new queen, and out of all the women in the kingdom, Esther was chosen. Think about that for a second. A girl who grew up an orphan from a minority group in a foreign land ends up sitting on a throne next to one of the most powerful men in the world at that time. That's not something you plan. That's something that feels like it was set up before she even knew it was happening. But being queen didn't mean her problems were over. In fact, the real challenge hadn't even started yet. There was a man in the king's court named Haman. Haman was proud, and he wanted everyone to bow down to him. But Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refused to bow. He wouldn't do it, and that made Haman furious. So furious that he didn't just want to punish Mordecai. He wanted to destroy every single Jewish person in the entire kingdom. He convinced the king to sign a law that would allow the killing of Esther's entire people on a specific day, with no way to stop it once the order was official. Now here's where it gets personal for Esther. She was queen. She had a position of comfort. She had a life that looked safe from the outside. But the people this law was going to destroy were her own people, her own family, her own blood. And nobody in the palace even knew she was Jewish, because she had kept it hidden this whole time. So Mordecai sends her a message. He tells her what's happening, and he asks her to go to the king and beg for her people's lives. And this is where Esther has to face something we all face at some point. The moment where doing the right thing could cost you everything. See, in that kingdom, there was a law that said nobody could approach the king without being called first, not even the queen. If you walked in uninvited, the punishment was death, unless the king personally held out his golden scepter to spare you. Esther hadn't been called by the king in 30 days. That alone was already a bad sign. It meant she wasn't exactly in his favor at that moment. Walking in now, uninvited, to ask him to reverse a law he already signed, protecting people he didn't even know were her own family, could get her killed on the spot. So she's caught in the middle. Stay quiet, stay safe, and watch her people be destroyed, or speak up and risk her own life. This is the kind of decision that separates people who talk about faith from people who actually live it out. And notice what Esther does not do. She doesn't rush in immediately out of panic. She doesn't ignore the problem and hope it goes away either. She does something a lot of people skip when they're scared. She stops, and she prays. She sends word back to Mordecai and tells him to gather all the Jewish people in the city and fast for her, not eating or drinking for 3 days and nights. She says she and her servants will do the same. And after that, she says something that has echoed through history ever since. She says, "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." That's not the language of someone who has no fear. That's the language of someone who is terrified, but decides to move forward anyway. That's what real courage actually looks like. It's not the absence of fear. It's choosing obedience and love, even when fear is screaming at you to stay quiet. But before she takes a single step toward that throne room, she stops everything and turns to prayer first. 3 days of fasting. 3 days of seeking God before seeking a solution on her own strength. She didn't walk in relying on her charm, or her position as queen, or her own cleverness. She walked in after she had already gone to God first. That's a lesson a lot of us miss today. We want the breakthrough, but we skip the part where we get quiet, we fast, we pray, and we prepare our hearts before we take the big step. Esther shows us that the boldest actions in life should be preceded by the deepest moments of prayer, not the other way around. After those 3 days, she puts on her royal robes, and she walks toward the king's inner court. Can you imagine that walk? Every step closer to that throne room. She doesn't know if she's walking toward her death or toward the saving of her entire nation. Her heart is probably pounding. Her hands are probably shaking. But she keeps walking, and then the moment of truth arrives. The king sees her standing there, uninvited, and instead of calling for her execution, he holds out his golden scepter toward her. That single motion means her life is spared. She's allowed to approach. This is the turning point of the whole story. This is where obedience through fear starts to produce fruit. She doesn't immediately blurt out the whole situation, though. She's wise about it. She invites the king and Haman to a private banquet. Then she invites them to a second banquet the next day. She's building the moment, choosing the right timing, letting things unfold with patience instead of panic. And in that time between banquets, something incredible happens completely outside of her control. The king can't sleep one night, so he asks for the palace records to be read to him. And it just so happens that what gets read is the record of Mordecai, once saving the king's life from an assassination plot, something that had been completely forgotten and never rewarded. That is not a coincidence. When you are walking in obedience, even when you're scared, God is already moving pieces behind the scenes that you cannot see. The very next day, Haman, the man planning to destroy Esther's whole people, ends up being forced to publicly honor Mordecai, the man he hated most. Talk about a plan falling apart in the most ironic way possible. Then, at the second banquet, Esther finally reveals the truth to the king. She tells him she is Jewish. She tells him about Haman's plot to destroy her and her people. The king is furious, and by the end of that day, the very trap Haman built to destroy Mordecai ends up being the trap that destroys Haman himself. And because Esther was brave enough to speak up, the king allows a new law to be made, giving the Jewish people the right to defend themselves. What started as a guaranteed massacre turns into a story of survival and victory, all because one woman decided that fear was not going to be the final word in her story. So what do we actually take from this? First, courage doesn't mean you're not scared. Esther was terrified. She even said it herself, but she moved forward anyway because she knew there was something bigger than her own comfort at stake. Second, before you take the big leap, go to God first. Esther didn't walk into that throne room on her own strength. She fasted. She prayed. She prepared her spirit before she prepared her plan. If she needed that kind of preparation, so do we. Third, timing and wisdom still matter, even when you're being brave. She didn't just blurt everything out in one impulsive moment. She was patient. She waited for the right timing, and she trusted the process even while stepping into the unknown. And fourth, sometimes you were placed exactly where you are for a reason. You don't fully understand yet. Esther didn't become queen by accident. She was positioned for that exact moment, long before she even knew a crisis was coming. You might be going through a season right now that feels random, but it could be preparing you for a moment you can't see yet either. If you've been holding back from something you know you need to do, whether it's a hard conversation, a bold decision, a step of faith that scares you, or just speaking up when it would be easier to stay quiet, let Esther's story remind you of something important. You don't have to feel ready. You don't have to feel brave. You just have to be willing to pray first, and then take the step anyway. Because sometimes the very thing you're avoiding out of fear is the exact thing that was designed to save the people around you. If this story spoke to you, watch the next video because it goes even deeper into what real prayer looks like when your back is against the wall.